Hey guys, welcome back to Bixby's Beer Reviews. Great to have you here with me again. Now, if you're a longtime BBR viewer, you know that one of the founding precepts of this channel and of my personal philosophy about beer is that wherever possible, wherever you live, you should seek out local breweries that are taking interesting ingredients and techniques that incorporate things that are specific to your area into their beers, specific ingredients or foods or traditions from your area, because I think it gives you a really unique and fun type of beer that you can't get anywhere else. And so we've done that a little bit, but today we're going to take this way further than we ever have before. From Black Narrows Brewing Company out of Chincoteague, Virginia. Today we have Longleaf IPA. Now, I know what you're thinking, and yes, that is a red brocaded woodpecker perched on the side of a native Virginia longleaf pine. And that is, of course, where the beer gets its name from. Why is it named after this particular tree, you ask? That is because this beer is hopped, not with hops, mind you, but with the pine needles, the pine cones, and the bark of the Virginia native longleaf pine. Now, I know what you're saying. What the Mr. Bixby? Get this stupid pine tree beer off of my YouTubes. To which I would reply, first of all, don't talk to me that way. This is my beer review channel, and I'll review whatever beers I want. And second of all, not only is this beer not nearly as outside of the brewing mainstream as you might suspect, but it's actually kind of part of its own tradition of sort of non-hop alternatives that have been used in beers for a very long time. I mean, if you think back to some of the beers that we've had here, we've certainly had beers with spices in them, whether those are things like coriander and salt, which are a little bit more savory, or very cinnamon and other kind of sweet spices. Of course, we've also had beers that have herbs in them, like lavender and rosemary from the garden, and it's far from unusual to see a beer that incorporates things like hibiscus or chamomile or other tea type notes. And in fact, some of you may even know that there's certainly been a number of examples over the years of beers brewed with spruce tips. That was actually fairly popular for beers made hundreds of years ago in America where hops weren't available. Some of you may have even heard of brewed, a beer brewed entirely without hops, particularly with botanicals. But again, I don't know that I've ever seen a beer that uses pine needles, pine cones, and pine tree stuff specifically. But here we got one, so let's crack it open, take a look. One fun feature about this beer is, in addition to being something you can drink, some of the proceeds, I believe, also go to help support the Nature Conservancy's efforts to conserve and restore the longleaf pine population here in Virginia. So it's not just for a good time, it's also for a good cause. But let's take a look. As I said, this is I suppose, in a sense, classic American IPA. It comes in at 5.9% ABV. Let's go ahead and take a look here. You can see it is relatively unfiltered in there. You might almost even say hazy. A little bit of light getting through the bottom there, but clearly a little rustic, but has a nice little fluffy head there. You can tell it has some carbonation to it. In all respects, mostly looking like an unfiltered IPA so far. Relatively pale, relatively light. So that's what it looks like. Let's give this a smell. First off, surprisingly subtle aroma. I don't know that I necessarily had any strong preconceptions coming into this, but when you say that you've dumped a bunch of actual tree parts into the boil, I don't really know where that's going to go. And so I wouldn't say it's some sort of huge blast of pine notes, although I would say, this is probably not going to be surprising, Simcoe is sort of the first place my brain went here. But an interesting thing is I'll note that it has a not unsweet note to it. I wouldn't say to go so far as to say as it's citrusy, but there's something fresh and light and just a little bit sunny about it that sort of counterbalances that little bit more of a pine forest that you would expect to get from this and that I mostly get. So it's an interesting, a slightly more complex note than I would have suspected. But that's what it smells like. Let's go ahead and give this one a taste. That is a delightfully light and easygoing IPA. I will say that if you did not tell me that it was hopped with tree parts, I would not necessarily be able to pick that out, if only because it's light, it's effervescent, it has a pleasing bitterness that's insistent without being overpowering, and it has a very light, subtle, piney note on the finish. So, if you told me this was just sort of a throwback, unfiltered American IPA that had been lightly hopped with Simcoe or something similar, like maybe, say, Cascade, I'd probably believe you. It doesn't quite bring the sort of grapefruity notes that you would maybe associate with IPAs from that era that use a lot of American hops, and instead just sort of finishes with a slightly lighter, cleaner bitterness with a little bit of those foresty notes that it starts out with. But overall, it's very pleasing. It has an interesting note, whereas Simcoe to me can sometimes be very strong and almost overwhelming of some of the more delicate hops it gets put in there with. This one's still a little bit restrained. It's letting a little bit of the pale malt shine through. And it does have a nice, dry, kind of clean note at the finish. It's a little bit more on the West Coast in that vein. So overall, a very interesting, fun, light, easy drinking IPA, one I feel like I could have with food or one that I could just enjoy after a long day. So thanks for joining me for this unusually hopped beer. It was certainly an interesting journey that ended up in a very pleasing place. I feel like this is an IPA I could have just about every day. It's that light and refreshing and interesting. But if you have any other suggestions for what you want to see, no ingredient is too unusual. If I can find it, I'll drink it and I'll review it for you. But until then, thanks for joining me. Look forward to seeing you next time here on the BBR. Bye now.